The first time Darius Kincaid saw the gas station, he almost laughed, but something in his chest felt too heavy for that. It stood at the edge of a forgotten highway in western Oklahoma, paint peeling off in long, tired strips, the old neon sign flickering like it was struggling to remember its purpose. The gravel lot was cracked and uneven, weeds pushing through every gap like nature was quietly reclaiming what people had abandoned years ago. This was what his uncle had left him. Not a house, not savings, not anything that made sense, just this dying piece of land that smelled faintly of gasoline and dust. Darius hadn't spoken to his uncle in over a decade, not since a family argument that no one ever fully explained. And now, standing there alone with a set of keys that felt heavier than they should, he couldn't help but wonder why this place had been passed down to him at all. About 100 words into his own thoughts, standing there in silence, Darius found himself doing something strange. He pulled out his phone, opened the camera, and quietly said, "If you're watching this, I guess I'm about to figure out why someone would leave me a place like this." It wasn't planned, just instinct. Maybe it was the loneliness of the moment, or maybe it was the strange feeling that something about this place mattered more than it seemed. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and walked forward, boots crunching against gravel, the wind pushing lightly against the rusted door. The key turned with resistance, like it hadn't been used in years, and when the door finally creaked open, a wave of stale air hit him, thick with time and secrets that hadn't been disturbed. Inside, the station was frozen in another era. Old shelves still held faded snack wrappers, dusty soda bottles, and expired cans that looked like they belonged in a museum rather than a store. The register sat crooked on the counter, its screen dark, its buttons worn from hands long gone. A calendar hung on the wall behind it, stuck on a date from nearly 15 years ago, as if time itself had simply stopped moving in this place. Darius moved slowly, his eyes scanning every corner, trying to understand what his uncle had seen in all of this. He remembered faint stories, how his uncle had refused to sell the land even when developers had offered good money, how he insisted that some things aren't meant to be given up. At the time, everyone thought he was just being stubborn. Now, standing here, Darius wasn't so sure. As he stepped behind the counter, something unusual caught his attention. Not immediately obvious, but just enough to feel out of place. The floor near the back wall looked slightly different, the concrete a shade darker, smoother, like it had been replaced or covered at some point. He crouched down, brushing away a thin layer of dust with his hand, revealing faint lines that didn't match the rest of the flooring. His heart slowed, not out of fear but curiosity, the kind that pulls you deeper before you even realize it. He pressed his palm against the surface, feeling the cold firmness beneath it, and for a brief moment, the silence of the entire station seemed to close in around him. There was something here. Not obvious, not loud, but something hidden just beneath the surface, waiting quietly, like it had been for years. Darius kept his hand pressed against the strange patch of concrete longer than he expected, as if holding it there might somehow reveal what was hidden underneath. The air inside the station felt heavier now, quieter in a way that made every small movement echo just a little louder. He shifted his weight and tapped the surface lightly with his knuckles, listening carefully. The sound that came back wasn't solid and dense like the rest of the floor. It was slightly hollow, just enough to make his pulse pick up. He sat back on his heels, staring at the outline again, noticing how the edges formed a near-perfect rectangle. This wasn't random damage or a rushed repair job. Someone had done this deliberately, and they had done it carefully. His uncle wasn't the type to do anything halfway, and that thought alone made Darius lean in closer, his curiosity now mixed with a quiet sense of urgency he couldn't quite explain. He stood up slowly and looked around the room, scanning for anything that could help him open whatever this was. The station didn't offer much at first glance, just rusted tools, broken shelves, and years of neglect. But then he remembered the small storage room behind the counter. The door was half open, its hinges squeaking softly as he pushed it wider. Inside, the air was even thicker, filled with the scent of old wood and machine oil. Shelves lined the walls, cluttered with boxes, tools, and things that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. Darius moved carefully, brushing dust aside, until his hand landed on a heavy crowbar leaning against the corner. It was worn but solid, its metal surface cold and dependable. For a moment, he just held it, weighing the decision in his mind. This wasn't just about breaking open a floor. It felt like crossing into something his uncle had intentionally hidden. When he returned to the main room, the light filtering through the dirty windows seemed dimmer, as if the day outside had quietly shifted while he wasn't paying attention. He positioned the tip of the crowbar along one of the faint seams and pressed down gently at first, testing the resistance. The concrete didn't move right away, but the sound it made confirmed what he already suspected. There was space beneath it. He adjusted his grip and pushed harder this time, the metal scraping against the edge as a small crack formed. Dust lifted into the air, catching the light in thin, drifting streaks. Darius paused, his breath steady but slower now, aware that he was getting closer to something real. With another firm push, the edge finally lifted just enough to get a better hold, and a low, grinding sound filled the room as the piece began to shift. It took several minutes of effort, each movement slow and controlled, but eventually, the slab gave way enough for him to pull it back. What lay beneath wasn't what he expected. Not dirt, not pipes, not anything ordinary. Instead, there was a metal surface, smooth and dark, with a circular handle set into the center. It looked like a hatch, the kind you'd see in older industrial buildings or hidden basements. Darius leaned over it, brushing away the remaining dust, his fingers tracing the edges as if confirming it was real. The temperature near the opening felt slightly cooler, a faint draft rising up from below, carrying with it a scent that was unfamiliar but not unpleasant, cleaner, almost preserved. He sat back again, staring at the handle, realizing that whatever his uncle had left behind wasn't just a forgotten gas station. It was something far more intentional, something buried deep enough to stay hidden. Until now, Darius hovered over the metal hatch for a long moment, his fingers resting lightly on the circular handle, as if it might react to his touch. The cool air rising from the seams carried a faint metallic scent, cleaner than anything else in the station, like whatever lay beneath had been sealed away from time itself. He exhaled slowly, steadying his thoughts, trying to make sense of why his uncle would go through the trouble of hiding something like this under layers of concrete. It didn't feel like a random decision or a desperate act. It felt planned, deliberate, almost patient. The kind of patience that waits years for the right person to arrive. That thought made him pull his hand back slightly, not out of fear, but out of respect for the unknown weight of what he was about to uncover. He shifted his position and gripped the handle more firmly this time, testing it with a careful pull. At first, nothing happened, the hatch resisting as if it had fused into place over the years. He adjusted his stance, planting his boots firmly against the floor, and pulled again with more strength. A deep, muted click echoed from within the metal, followed by a slow release of pressure that he could feel more than hear. The hatch lifted just a fraction, enough for a thin line of darkness to appear beneath it. Darius paused, his heartbeat steady but louder in his ears now, as if his body understood the significance of this moment before his mind fully caught up. Then, with one controlled motion, he pulled the hatch open further, the hinges moving with a low, heavy sound that filled the silent station. What revealed itself below wasn't chaotic or unfinished like the rest of the building. It was structured, precise. A narrow set of metal stairs descended into a dimly lit space, the walls lined with smooth panels that reflected a soft, almost sterile glow from small embedded lights. It didn't match the gas station above in any way. This place looked maintained, preserved, as if it had been waiting untouched rather than abandoned. Darius leaned forward slightly, gripping the edge of the opening as he looked down, trying to gauge how deep it went. The stairs curved just enough to hide the bottom from view, creating a quiet sense of depth that pulled at his curiosity. For a brief moment, he considered stepping back, closing the hatch, pretending he hadn't found any of this. But the thought passed as quickly as it came. He stood there a little longer, letting the silence settle around him, then reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone again. Without overthinking it, he turned on the camera and spoke quietly. "There's something under here, and it doesn't look like it belongs to a gas station." His voice sounded calm, but there was an edge to it, something sharper than before. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and placed one foot onto the first metal step, testing its stability. It held firm. The second step felt just as solid. With each movement, the distance between him and the world above grew smaller, replaced by the quiet certainty that whatever he was walking into had been meant for him to find. And as he descended further, the hatch above remained open, letting in just enough light to remind him that there was still a way back, even if he no longer felt the need to take it. Each step down felt heavier than the last, not because of the effort, but because of the growing realization that this place had been built with intention far beyond anything Darius had expected. The metal stairs didn't creak or shift. They were solid, perfectly aligned, almost new despite the years that must have passed above. The soft lighting embedded along the walls cast a steady glow, guiding his way without flickering, without hesitation. It gave the space a strange sense of calm, like it wasn't meant to intimidate, but to quietly welcome whoever found their way down. Still, the deeper he went, the more distant the outside world felt, until the sounds of wind and gravel and rusted doors were replaced entirely by silence. It wasn't an empty silence either. It felt contained, deliberate, as if every sound had been carefully removed from this place. When his boots finally reached the bottom step, Darius paused, taking in the room around him. It wasn't large, but it was meticulously organized. Metal shelves lined the walls, holding sealed boxes, labeled containers, and equipment that looked far more modern than anything upstairs. A long work table stood in the center, its surface clean except for a single closed folder placed precisely in the middle. The air was cooler here, controlled, carrying none of the decay that lingered above. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning every detail, trying to piece together what his uncle had been doing in a place like this. This wasn't storage. It wasn't a panic room. It looked like a workspace, one that had been left exactly as it was, as if someone had simply stepped away with the intention of returning. Darius moved closer to the table, his footsteps soft against the smooth floor, and stopped just short of the folder. There was something about it that felt personal, like it had been left specifically for him to find. He reached out, then hesitated for a brief second, his mind running through possibilities that didn't quite settle into anything clear. Finally, he opened it. Inside were documents, neatly arranged, filled with typed pages, diagrams, and notes written in his uncle's unmistakable handwriting. The first page carried a title that made his chest tighten slightly, not out of fear, but out of recognition. This wasn't random. This was a record. As he flipped through the pages, he saw references to land coordinates, financial logs, and something that appeared repeatedly, underlined and circled in careful strokes, as if it had mattered more than everything else combined. He leaned against the edge of the table, reading more closely now, his focus sharpening with every line. The notes weren't chaotic. They were structured, methodical, almost like instructions or a long-term plan. His uncle had documented everything. Transactions that didn't match any normal business, locations that stretched across multiple states, and symbols that appeared next to certain entries like markers of importance. One page, slightly worn compared to the others, stood out. It wasn't filled with numbers or diagrams, just a short, handwritten message at the top. If you're reading this, then you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Darius stared at those words longer than he expected, the weight of them settling in slowly. This wasn't just something hidden, it was something meant to be found. And for the first time since arriving at the gas station, he began to understand that his uncle hadn't left him something useless at all. Darius kept his eyes on that single handwritten line longer than anything else in the folder, letting the meaning settle into him slowly instead of rushing past it. If you're reading this, then you're exactly where you're supposed to be. It didn't feel like a dramatic message or something written in panic. It felt calm, certain, almost reassuring in a way that didn't match the secrecy of everything around him. He flipped the page carefully, revealing more handwritten notes beneath, each one precise and deliberate. His uncle had always been a quiet man, the kind who spoke only when necessary, but these pages felt like the most he had ever said at once. There were instructions here, but not in a direct step-by-step format. Instead, it read like a guide meant for someone who needed to understand the bigger picture before taking any action. Darius found himself leaning closer, fully absorbed now, the outside world completely gone from his thoughts. As he read further, patterns began to form. The financial records weren't just random numbers. They tracked something specific, something consistent over many years. Large amounts of money had moved through accounts that didn't seem connected to any official business, all tied to the same locations listed throughout the notes. Some were in small towns, others near highways or rural areas, all places that would easily go unnoticed. Next to several of these entries were small symbols, the same ones he had noticed earlier, and now they started to make more sense. They weren't decorative or meaningless. They marked something important, something that had been repeated across different sites. Darius stepped back slightly, his mind trying to piece it together. This wasn't just about one gas station. This was part of something bigger, something his uncle had been managing quietly for years without anyone else knowing. He turned another page and found a rough map sketched by hand, lines connecting multiple points across several states, each one labeled with the same symbols and small notes in the margins. The gas station he stood beneath was one of those points, marked clearly, but it wasn't the center. It was just one piece of a network. The realization hit him slowly, not like a sudden shock, but like a steady build of understanding that grew heavier with each second. His uncle hadn't been holding on to this land out of stubbornness. He had been protecting something, maintaining it, watching over it. Darius traced one of the lines on the map with his finger, following it from Oklahoma to another marked location hundreds of miles away. Whatever this network was, it wasn't random, and it wasn't temporary. It had been built to last. At the bottom of the folder, beneath all the documents and diagrams, there was something else. A small, sealed envelope, thicker than the others, with his name written on the front in the same steady handwriting. Darius picked it up slowly, turning it over in his hands as if expecting it to reveal something without being opened. It felt different from the rest, more personal, like everything else had been preparation for whatever was inside. He hesitated for a moment, not out of fear, but because he understood that once he opened it, there would be no going back to not knowing. The quiet room seemed to close in slightly, the soft hum of the hidden space the only sound around him. Then, with a steady breath, he slid his finger under the seal and began to open it, fully aware that whatever came next would change the way he saw everything his uncle had left behind. The envelope opened with a soft tear, the sound unusually loud in the stillness of the underground room. Darius slid out a single folded sheet, thicker than regular paper, along with a small metallic object that clinked lightly against the table as it fell free. For a moment, he ignored the object and focused on the letter, unfolding it carefully. The handwriting was the same, steady, deliberate, unmistakably his uncle's. But this time it felt more direct, like it had been written without the layers of distance present in the rest of the notes. The first line pulled him in immediately, not because of what it said, but because of how it said it, like a voice speaking across time with quiet certainty. It didn't waste words explaining the past or apologizing for anything. Instead, it acknowledged the present, as if his uncle had always known this exact moment would come. As Darius read, the weight of everything began to shift into something clearer. The network of locations, the hidden space beneath the station, the carefully tracked finances. It wasn't about profit in the way he had first assumed. It was about control, protection, and timing. His uncle had been safeguarding assets that didn't belong to any single person or business, assets that had been deliberately kept out of sight for reasons that weren't fully spelled out but strongly implied. The letter didn't list names or organizations, but it hinted at agreements, at responsibilities passed quietly between people who understood the importance of staying invisible. Darius felt a strange mix of disbelief and recognition, as if part of him had always known his uncle's life wasn't as simple as it appeared. The man who had refused to sell this useless gas station had been holding on to something far more significant than land. He lowered the letter slowly, his eyes drifting to the small metallic object that had fallen out with it. It was a key, but not like any key he had seen before. Its design was minimal, almost industrial, with a smooth surface and a small engraved symbol that matched the markings he had seen throughout the documents. It wasn't meant for a standard lock. It was part of something else, something that connected directly to the system his uncle had built. Darius picked it up, turning it between his fingers, feeling its weight. It wasn't heavy, but it carried a sense of purpose that made it feel more significant than it looked. His gaze moved back to the letter, scanning the final lines again, searching for anything that might explain exactly what he was supposed to do next. The instructions, when they came, weren't loud or demanding. They were simple, almost understated. Follow the map, trust the system, and most importantly, don't involve anyone who doesn't already understand. Darius sat there for a moment, letting those words settle in, realizing that this wasn't something he could treat casually or walk away from without consequence. The room around him no longer felt like a discovery. It felt like a responsibility. He folded the letter carefully, placing it back on the table, and closed his hand around the key, his grip tightening slightly, as if grounding himself in the reality of what he now held. Above him, the abandoned gas station still stood quiet and forgotten, but beneath it, everything had changed. And without fully realizing it, Darius had already begun to step into a role his uncle had been preparing him for, long before he ever knew it existed. Darius stayed seated at the edge of the table for a while, the letter folded neatly in front of him and the key resting in his palm, as if his body needed time to adjust to what his mind had just accepted. The quiet hum of the room no longer felt unfamiliar. It felt steady, almost grounding, like the space itself was designed to keep everything clear and controlled. He leaned back slightly, his eyes drifting across the shelves again, noticing details he had overlooked before. This wasn't just a hidden room. It was part of a system that had been maintained with discipline. Every box was labeled with dates and codes, every piece of equipment placed with intention. His uncle hadn't built something temporary here. He had built something meant to continue, even in his absence. That realization didn't come with panic. It came with a strange, quiet sense of direction that Darius hadn't felt in years. He stood up slowly, slipping the key into his pocket, and moved toward one of the shelves that held several sealed containers. Each one carried the same symbol engraved on the key, along with a series of numbers that seemed to match the entries in the folder. He picked one up carefully, feeling its weight, then set it back in place without opening it. Whatever was inside, it wasn't meant to be handled impulsively. The letter had been clear about that. This system relied on patience, on understanding the sequence before taking action. Darius stepped back and turned his attention toward the map again, mentally tracing the path between locations. The nearest marked point wasn't far, just a few hours' drive if the roads were clear. The thought settled in quietly, not as a question, but as the next step waiting to be taken. For the first time since arriving, he pulled his phone out again, not to record this time, but to check something simple. The date, the time, the outside world still moving as if nothing had changed. It felt almost distant now, like it belonged to a different version of him who hadn't walked down those stairs. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and took one last look around the room, making sure everything was exactly as he had found it. The folder was placed back in the center of the table, the envelope resting on top, the pages aligned with the same precision his uncle had left behind. It wasn't about being careful anymore. It was about respecting the system he had just become part of. Even small details felt important now, like they carried weight beyond their size. When he finally turned toward the stairs, the decision had already been made without needing to be spoken out loud. He climbed back up slowly, each step bringing him closer to the worn, silent world above. As he reached the top, he paused just before pulling himself out, glancing back one last time into the hidden space. The soft lighting remained steady, unchanged, as if it would continue waiting no matter how long he stayed away. Then he pushed the hatch closed, guiding it carefully into place until it settled flush with the floor again. The gas station returned to its quiet, abandoned state, nothing on the surface hinting at what lay beneath. But Darius stood there differently now, no longer seeing a useless building, no longer questioning why it had been left to him. Instead, he saw it for what it truly was, the beginning of something that had already been set in motion. By the time Darius stepped outside, the light had shifted into a softer, late-afternoon glow, stretching long shadows across the cracked gravel lot. The air felt warmer than before, almost unfamiliar after the controlled stillness below, and for a moment he just stood there, letting the open space settle around him. The highway in the distance carried the occasional hum of passing cars, But none of them slowed. None of them noticed the quiet station sitting just far enough off the road to be forgotten. It struck him how easily something important could exist in plain sight and still go completely unseen. He reached into his pocket, feeling the key again, grounding himself in the reality that what he had found wasn't imagined. This place wasn't the end of something. It was a starting point, one that his uncle had carefully positioned and protected. He walked over to his truck, the sound of his boots against the gravel steady and deliberate, and opened the driver's door. For a second, he hesitated before getting in, his eyes drifting back to the station one more time. There was a quiet tension in that moment, not doubt, but awareness. Leaving meant moving forward, stepping fully into something he didn't completely understand yet. But staying wouldn't change anything either. He climbed in, closed the door, and started the engine, the familiar vibration breaking through the stillness. The map he had studied was clear in his mind, the next location marked with the same symbol as the key now resting in the console beside him. It wasn't far, but it was far enough to give him time to think, to let everything settle into something more solid than questions. The drive felt different from any road trip he had taken before, even though the highway looked the same as always. Long stretches of asphalt cutting through open land, scattered signs pointing to towns that barely registered on most maps. But now, every mile carried a sense of direction that went beyond distance. He found himself noticing things he would have ignored before. Old buildings set back from the road, quiet intersections, places that seemed ordinary but now held the possibility of being part of something larger. His uncle's map had changed the way he saw everything, turning the landscape into a network rather than a collection of random locations. And somewhere along that network was the next point, the next piece of whatever this system truly was. As the sun began to dip lower, casting a deeper amber tone across the sky, Darius spotted the turn he had been looking for. A narrow road branching off the highway, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. He slowed the truck and turned onto it, the tires shifting from smooth pavement to a rougher, quieter path. The road stretched ahead with no clear destination in sight, lined with aging fences and scattered trees that leaned slightly with the wind. There were no signs, no markers to confirm he was in the right place, but he didn't need them. The map, the key, the letter, they had already led him this far. And as he drove deeper down the empty road, the feeling grew stronger. Not of uncertainty, but of alignment, like he was moving exactly where he was meant to go next. The road narrowed further as Darius continued, the trees on either side growing denser, their branches stretching just enough to filter the fading sunlight into thin, shifting patterns across the windshield. The deeper he drove, the quieter everything became, until even the distant hum of the highway disappeared completely. It felt like crossing an invisible line, leaving behind the familiar world and entering a space that existed just outside of it. His grip on the steering wheel remained steady, his focus sharpened by a quiet awareness that he was getting close. The map had shown this stretch as unmarked, almost intentionally vague, but the distance matched and the timing felt right. When the road finally curved slightly to the left, revealing a small clearing ahead, he slowed the truck instinctively, his eyes scanning the area with a mix of caution and recognition. At first glance, the clearing didn't seem like much, just a worn-out structure sitting alone, partially hidden by overgrown grass and a leaning fence that had long since lost its purpose. It looked like an old supply shed or maybe a forgotten service building, the kind of place people would pass by without a second thought. But as Darius pulled closer and cut the engine, he noticed something familiar. The placement of the building, the angle of the entrance, even the way the ground around it had settled. It all carried the same subtle precision he had seen at the gas station. This wasn't abandoned by accident. It had been left this way on purpose. He stepped out of the truck, the cool evening air brushing against him, and stood still for a moment, listening. Nothing moved except the wind, but the silence here felt just as intentional as the silence below the station. He walked toward the structure slowly, each step measured, his eyes taking in every detail. The door was old but intact, its surface worn yet sturdy, and just beside the handle was a small marking, faint, almost invisible unless you knew to look for it. The same symbol. Darius reached into his pocket and pulled out the key, holding it up briefly as if comparing it to the marking, even though he already knew it would match. The connection between the two wasn't coincidence. It was design. He stepped closer, his hand steady as he brought the key toward the lock. For a brief second he paused, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness that this moment carried weight, just like the one before the hatch had opened. Then he inserted the key and turned it. The mechanism responded instantly, smooth and precise, like it had been waiting. The door unlocked with a quiet click, and as Darius pushed it open, the hinges moved without resistance, revealing a dim interior that mirrored the controlled stillness he had already come to recognize. He stepped inside, the light from outside stretching just far enough to outline another carefully maintained space beneath the surface level. It wasn't identical to the gas station, but the pattern was unmistakable. Hidden access, preserved environment, deliberate structure. He turned slightly, looking back toward the open doorway, where the last light of day lingered at the edge of the clearing. There was no uncertainty left now, no question about whether he was in the right place. The system his uncle had built was real, and it extended far beyond a single location. And as the door slowly settled behind him, the outside world fading once again, Darius moved forward, fully aware that he was no longer just discovering something hidden. He was becoming part of it. The moment the door closed behind him, the interior lights activated with the same quiet precision Darius had seen before, revealing a space that felt both familiar and entirely new at the same time. The layout mirrored the underground room at the gas station in purpose, but this one was larger, more advanced, as if each location in the network had its own role to play. Shelves lined the walls again, but these held different materials, sealed cases, reinforced containers, and equipment that looked more specialized, more refined. In the center of the room stood another table, but instead of a simple folder, this one displayed a small terminal screen, dark but waiting. Darius stepped closer, his movements steady, no longer driven by curiosity alone, but by a growing sense of responsibility. Whatever this system was, it wasn't scattered or random. It was layered, intentional, and designed to be understood, piece by piece. He placed the key gently on the table, and almost immediately the terminal responded, its screen lighting up with a soft glow that cut through the dim room. Lines of information began to appear, not chaotic but organized, showing records that extended far beyond what he had seen in the first location. This wasn't just about hidden assets anymore. It was about coordination, about maintaining something that required oversight and continuity. Darius leaned in slightly, his eyes scanning the data, recognizing patterns that now felt clearer than before. The network wasn't inactive. It had been waiting, holding steady until someone stepped in to take control. And that someone, whether he had expected it or not, was now him. The realization didn't feel overwhelming. It felt grounding, like stepping into a role that had been quietly prepared long before he ever arrived. For a moment, he allowed himself to think about his uncle, not as the distant, quiet figure he had known growing up, but as the man who had built all of this without recognition, without explanation, trusting that one day it would be understood. There was no longer any sense of confusion about why the gas station had been left to him. It had never been about the building itself. It had been about access, about trust, about continuing something that couldn't simply be handed over to just anyone. Darius picked up the key again, holding it with a steadier grip this time, no longer seeing it as a mystery but as a tool, a connection between every hidden point in the system. The uncertainty that had followed him at the beginning was gone, replaced by clarity that felt earned rather than given. He stepped back from the table, taking one last look around the room, knowing this wasn't an ending, but a continuation that would stretch far beyond this moment. The path ahead wasn't fully mapped out, but it didn't need to be, not all at once. What mattered was that he understood where to begin and how to move forward. As he turned toward the exit, the quiet hum of the space remained steady behind him, unchanged, ready for whatever came next. And somewhere beyond this single location, beyond the gas station and the roads he had already traveled, The rest of the network waited, just as it always had. If this story pulled you in, if it made you feel that quiet shift from curiosity to understanding, then don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because sometimes, the most ordinary things are only waiting for the right person to uncover what they were always meant to be.